Hello and welcome to the RICS World Built Environment HKA webinar, Construction Disputes in the Middle East, Managing the World's Highest Risk of Overruns. My name is Ken Creighton. I am the Director of Public Affairs and Thought Leadership at RICS. And today, the 8th of February, 2023, 9 o'clock London time, we're going to be exploring the latest HKA CRUX Insight report, which finds that construction projects in the Middle East faced the longest overruns of any global region, adding on average more than 80% to schedules, with claimed costs averaging 35.8% of project CAPEX. Amidst challenging global headwinds, how do trends in conflict causation, avoidance, and prevalence in the Middle East compare with the rest of the world? What are the key considerations for businesses wishing to avoid the risk of overruns on complex construction projects in the region? And as industry in the Middle East adjusts to more technically advanced projects, what lessons can be learned to avoid further distress on capital projects? I'm joined with an expert panel, which I'll ask now to say hello, give us their name and title before we jump in. Can we start with you, Nicola?
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Nicola Cayley. I'm a principal with HKA. I've been with HKA since 2010 and I'm currently based in our Abu Dhabi office.
Chris?
Thanks, Ken. My name is Chris Seymour, Regional Director for Mott MacDonald for Middle East, Africa and South Asia, and also Chair of the RICS Middle East and Africa Board.
Nikki?
Hi everyone, my name is Nikki Dobranu. I'm a branch director for Omnium International in Dubai. Thank
you. Now, before we get to the panel, focusing a bit on the CRUX Insight report, successful capital projects in the Middle East must factor in multiple risks relating to prevailing market conditions, project complexity, and headwinds. Projects in process and planning in the Middle East must also navigate ongoing disruption associated with the COVID legacy, alongside cost inflation and tighter headwinds stemming from the war in Europe. The CRUX Insight report 2022 was released by HKA at the end of last year, and you can find a link to the report pinned to the top of our Twitter feed at WBEF Community. The report was developed through HKA's integrated research program, analysis data on claims and disputes on 380 major capital projects in the Middle East, alongside other capital projects around the world. The report finds, on average, projects in the Middle East faced the longest overruns of any global region. The extra time claimed by contractors would on average add more than 83% to schedules. This is almost 15% higher than the global average, which is 68.6%. The report finds that claimed costs on disputes typically amounting to 35.8% of CAPEX. The Middle East region is also unique in having the world's most consistent top-ranking causes of distress on capital projects, namely change in project scope and design information that is either late or incomplete. Now, before we get to the questions, I want to welcome all of you, our audience. We have over 600 of you registered on the call right now and representing really every region in the world. So a very large welcome to you. We invite you to ask questions during this webinar, and I will endeavor to get to as many of those as I can for our panelists. Let's get started. Nicola, I'd like to ask the first question to you. Amid ongoing reverberations resulting from the geopolitical standoff over Russia, cost inflation being one, How are disputes in the Middle East likely to evolve?
Yes, thanks, Ken. I mean, as you say, there are a number of continuing impacts from past and ongoing events that continue to affect projects in the region. And I would say, in addition to the sort of Russian-Ukrainian situation that you mentioned there are also things such as the COVID long tail, extreme weather events, and even Brexit, amongst others. I mean, obviously today our discussion is focused on the sort of key indicators that came from CRUX in the Middle East, but supply chains for mega projects, of course, are global, and therefore I think all of these events have the potential for impact. And I think if we think about the title of the CRUX report, even sort of battling the headwinds, I think that says it all really. It kind of recognises that the current challenges are creating a number of global headwinds for the industry, and it's those that are affecting the projects both in progress and in planning, I would say. So I think there are a number of ways that we expect this to have an impact on disputes in the Middle East. I think firstly, there is the issue of how is it likely to impact projects that are currently being delivered. And we think there are several scenarios that could arise as a consequence of ongoing cost inflation. So I think for projects in delivery that are on fixed price lump sum contracts, particularly if those are longer contracts, then clearly the impact on profitability has the potential to be significant. Further, I think if those contracts don't contain escalation clauses, this will place additional cost pressures on the contractor. And the risk then is that this will then foster a claims culture approach, where essentially the contractor is trying to either meet his targets or even in some instances just remain solvent. So I think we see all of that as likely to lead to an increase in cost inflation related disputes. Related to the previous point, I think is the issue around increased risk of insolvency. The current headwinds really are a big challenge for the industry generally and globally. Construction companies' insolvencies are at the highest level for over a decade in certain countries. So I think there are certain circumstances where this is a particular pressure for businesses. So, for example, those that perhaps have weak balance sheets are overly leveraged, or even, as mentioned just now, are on longer term fixed price contracts. And of course, the failure of the wider supply chain is also a risk. One other area I think that we see as potential for disputes that arise from this cost situation are claims against consultants. So this would be in a situation, I guess, where a consultant has a contractor has submitted a fixed price bid on sort of based on a consultant's estimate, and incurs additional cost that can't be recovered from the employer. And then looks to perhaps submit a claim under negligence for those additional costs incurred. Obviously this is subject to the contract itself, but it remains nevertheless a risk. And then I guess looking at it from the other end of the telescope, trying to be more optimistic, perhaps we do think that perhaps the cost inflationary pressures might actually result in some more sensible negotiating positions, where perhaps parties seek to find a pragmatic solution rather than sort of strictly enforcing their contractual entitlements. And we saw some of that really during COVID. In fact, it was sort of encouraged by some governments around the world. And so we may very well see its like again. I guess in terms of projects that are in planning, I would just say that now is the time really to seek to devise creative solutions and to think about who will bear the risk of those cost overruns. Clearly there's a tension between probably what is the preferred position of the employer with a fixed cost model versus what is probably the preferred position of the contractor being a variable cost model. So I think in those circumstances there's a need to think about this risk sharing approach. And ways that this could be done really are either through a shared pain gain mechanism or through a fixed price, but with a mechanism to adjust for inflation. So I think I'll pause there and hand back to you, Ken, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicola. Can we turn to you, Chris? I'd like to explore, have you experienced any industry appetite to revise and rebalance the sharing or allocation of risk on major capital projects? If so, what do you see driving this?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. I think just picking up Nicola's last point, I think definitely over the last 2 years, on top of all of the other risks that there are present in construction, particularly in this region, the fixed price risk has repeatedly comes up as one of the biggest issues. We have seen, I think, some collaboration from clients in this respect, even though it's not written into the contracts, which is a really good thing to see, and a great that behaviour finding its way into the broader construction industry can only be a good thing. But I think the one of the things just to take, if you like, the side of the industry for a moment, and this is when I say the side of the industry, I'm also including the clients and project owners in that respect. The Middle East is a location that has arguably most of the world's greatest and most complex projects, and they're being undertaken in an environment that is also endeavouring to run parallel with a lot of other projects, infrastructure projects as well. So it's very difficult at the outset of a project to envisage the different risks that could arise, either in the fact that we are fundamentally constructing a prototype each time, or even how other projects may actually impinge or in a physical manner or a strategic manner on the project in hand. So let's be clear, this is not an easy job, and I think the numbers tend to indicate a massively underperforming industry. I would actually not buy that. It's definitely some big improvements that can be made, but also an awful lot has been achieved. I think the other thing to look at is to look at the some of the commercial realities of the contracting landscape here, and certainly the need to provide bonding as part of the security package of the contractor of the contract creates added weight for a contractor supply chain, which is competing with the outturn, bluntly put, the outturn profit that might be achieved. So in other words, if you're having to physically pay for bonding as part of the security package, there's inevitably some working capital. That always is in every construction contract. If you weigh that against the profit you might get at the outturn, you start looking at it and thinking, actually, this doesn't look like a particularly good business. And that has, in some instances, driven some of the international contracting organisations to decide to either reduce their businesses in the Middle East or leave completely. Now, if we look at from the client's perspective, they're looking for better outcomes. They would quite rightly say that nobody forced you to sign the contract, you signed it, so you must have been happy with the allocation at the outset. And so for me, it's very much about, I think, what the industry is probably lacking here, and in other international markets as well, is a decent conversation and some decent collaboration, and that can help to solve many things. If we look around the world, what has been done and achieved in other parts, we can see some interesting models. The UK recently brought out the construction playbook, which is a document that is trying to actually solve very similar problems that exist in the UK construction industry. And being a Brit, I think I'm entitled to say that I know that things aren't absolutely perfect there either. But this document introduces a process which does create some solutions, and there is a potential. And I know that the British Business Group is looking at it, and we're helping them do that as well amongst other colleagues in other organisations to see actually is this a solution that could also apply to the Middle East. As an example, it looks at 5 steps of a project. Only the last one is actually the construction step. So there's a huge amount of pre-planning beforehand, and sometimes we don't really see that existing in the projects in this region. By creating a more realistic pre-planning period, then there's the ability to complete the design. Many projects here are let with incomplete design, and therefore that scope change that you initially talked about, Ken, and is very clear in the HKA report, is resulting from the fact that maybe the design was not complete to start with. It talks about having a real risk management workshop at the beginning. A misallocation of risk indicates that one party or not is not happy with it. You can allocate risk any way you like, but coming back to the point again, if parties signed the contract, theoretically they were happy with that risk then. But what probably was not precise enough was the interpretation of the risk. Risk management workshops can understand by scenario planning what would happen in those risk events, and that's something that we don't always see in construction projects. So you see very much, the consultant will have a risk schedule, the contractor will, and probably the client also, but they don't really come together. And so I think there is also something that can be, by creating more collaboration around those risk events. Again, that's going to inform parties what might happen if this particular event takes place. It talks about using standard contract forms. Again, sometimes in this region we see they're heavily amended. When they're heavily amended, that mechanical arrangement of what happens when certain clauses are invoked can be absent, or it can be interpreted differently by different parties. And so that's something that, whilst it's probably been done for the best reasons and no doubt being undertaken by law firms, there's not an industry understanding of what this contract may mean, and that does create problems. One of the other areas that has worked in other parts is around using dispute avoidance panels. Now, the dispute avoidance panel is a collection of individuals, parties that have been appointed to look at scenarios as they happen during the construction project. And so when these events arise before a dispute is actually mobilized, they can actually have a look at the scenario and say, okay, in this instance, by interpreting the documents that are here, this is going to be the likely outcome. So this is almost a bit like, I guess you call it marriage guidance counselling in construction. It's bringing the parties together and advising how this is likely to play out. And that's been found to be extremely useful certainly in other markets for a start, reducing the number of disputes, reducing the number of claims, and parties quite often can come to their own conclusion about how the outcome of that particular event should take place. So I think this is definitely not the idea of a rebalancing of risk is certainly not something new in the construction industry internationally. I think there are certain things that are present in the Middle East, including around the nature of the projects, some of the custom and culture around how they are led, which has caused some differences in the way that risk should be undertaken. But I also think there are some models out there that could be helped, that could help that situation. And for me, I think the biggest piece is really around pre-construction collaboration.
Thank you for that great insight, Chris. Nicola, if we can come back to you. In your view, how much industry appetite is there in the Middle East for a move to more collaborative modes of operation?
Sorry, just on mute there. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, and I think, and probably picking up here on some of the matters that Chris expanded on just now, I think by way of context, collaborative contracting, collaborative ways of working, relational contracts, I think have been a hot topic in many countries around the world recently. Certain countries such as Australia, Netherlands, UK, USA, they've actually developed sort of bespoke contract forms to address that. And I think the key point about this sort of collaborative approach really is that they're intended to promote positive behaviours, some of which Chris just spoke about, but are around kind of achieving aligned purpose, so both parties are seeking to deliver the same objectives, to create continuous dialogue between the parties and to encourage and foster cooperative attitudes. So I would say globally, there is most definitely a growing demand for collaborative models. Why? What's the reason for that? Well, I think it's probably, there are a number of factors I would say, but it's partly driven, I think, from the results that we're seeing from transactional contracting, which, as represented in the CRUX, show the kind of levels of the problem that are being experienced and sort of demonstrate that certainly for complex projects, the current model simply isn't working. So I think probably what we're trying to do when we talk about a collaborative model, and that can mean many different things to many different people, is that primarily we're trying to align motivation so that everyone is motivated to achieve the same thing. So do I think there's an appetite in the region for a move towards this? Yes, I do. And why? What is motivating that? Again, I think it's poor outcomes. You know, if you think about the headline findings of CRUX there, time overruns of 83%, I think, and consistent problems with design and change. There's no question that those outcomes will be an influencing factor on parties' decisions. And then, and again, I think Chris alluded to this in his previous section, but there is the I guess you would describe it as the exit of contractors from the region, and also a change in attitude, I think, where some are not really prepared to accept that wholesale risk transfer position anymore, because it just doesn't make any commercial sense. And then I think the amount of work in the region as well is a factor, which means that contractors can afford to take a stronger position. And then the project complexity itself, I think as the projects just get more and more complex, then the need to think about what better ways of delivery really focus the mind. And I actually think that there are some positive indicators in the region of this appetite. So Chris mentioned earlier the construction playbook, the UK construction playbook, which I think is a very exciting development. So that's been in play, pardon the pun, in the UK since late 2020 for the public sector, and for the private sector, they introduced one at late 2022. As Chris said, the purpose of it really is to seek to drive positive change in the construction industry. And it focuses on such things, really the things that we've just spoken about. So appropriate allocation of risk, collaborative working, well-defined KPIs, and how to incentivize the contractor with fair reward and contract mechanisms. And then obviously that, I'm repeating that really because the interest there is exactly as Chris said, the British Business Group is assessing that playbook and considering how it can be adopted for the UAE region, which I find very exciting. I really look forward to seeing how that pans out. Other things, I think in Abu Dhabi, the government FIDIC contract, as I understand it, is under review. In KSA, there's the government tenders and procurement law that's been in place since 2019. That introduces a number of measures around payment obligations and interestingly allows for, doesn't prescribe, but allows for two-stage tender and framework agreements, which is a big step in the right direction. BIM mandated in certain circumstances in Dubai. That's been in place for a while, but I think it's the first step in a positive journey. And then not necessarily region specific, but perhaps indicative of kind of global trends in a sense. FIDIC are looking at producing its own international collaborative contract. and I understand that's sort of scheduled for release this year. So I think, you know, all of those things together, plus conversations like these and others that I've attended, really are kind of encouraging signs that there is a real will to move towards this more collaborative way of working.
Thank you, Nicola. Really, really deep, insightful information there. And Nikki, if we can come to you now, our some 300 people on the call right now, I know are dying to hear from you. Let's talk about the skills shortage. What do you see in regard to the skills shortage on top of the challenges associated with importing labor into the market? How this represents a now fundamental delivery risk across many of the states in the Middle East?
Yeah, the skills shortage, along with the challenges of importing this talent into the market, is becoming a fundamental delivery risk for projects in many states here. We also have people moving between various territories to maybe work on more challenging projects or get paid more. But the shortage of skilled workers, particularly in certain specialist areas, is leading to increased competition for resources. And companies actually end up auctioneering for people, paying higher costs, and then maybe because of that causing delays and affecting project delivery. I have a friend in the UK who works for HKA, and he shared with me a report on some environmental experts that HKA has, and some titles there just don't make sense to me because they're again, the way we're moving, most of these roles wouldn't have been there maybe a decade ago. There's one about air quality, vehicle interior air quality. Nobody thought about that maybe before, but this is something that we're moving towards. Noise modeling, wildlife protection. I don't think we've seen these roles a decade ago. So roles like this will become more and more important. Additionally, because we spoke about the pandemic earlier, Ken, you mentioned it in your intro, this has further worsened the skill shortage. It disrupted global labor markets and it created a lot of uncertainty. There's a recent trend that I spotted maybe 6 months ago, and I see that some publications talk about it. People returning to the office after a period of remote work or time off can find it challenging to readjust and to feel motivated. And this is a common experience amongst friends and peers. It may be to the lack of a clear direction or goals, maybe burnout, a lot of projects going on. But to overcome feelings like this, I think it's important for firms to identify the root cause and to set achievable goals, to prioritize self-care and establish a healthy work-life balance, not just to talk about it, but to actually work on it and to discuss it with people. Companies, as Korn Ferry puts it, are facing active disengagement, and this is again a need for firms to recreate purpose at work. Again, it's all about people and about skills, and companies need to make it worthwhile for people to come in. There's also restrictions, and I'm sure you're familiar with different names ending in nationalization processes in various countries across the GCC. That's also putting some restrictions on the importation of labor, and maybe to impose the locals, the nationals, to get into practices. And this is making it increasingly difficult for businesses to secure the necessary talent and the skills and expertise needed to deliver projects. There's also many states in our region who have ambitious plans for development and infrastructure projects, which again is putting additional pressure. Maybe we're in the right place because we have projects going on, maybe more than any other place in the world. But yeah, to sum up, the skill shortage and challenges associated with bringing this labor in the region are a significant risk to project delivery, and we need to carefully manage, maybe through business, by the businesses operating in this region.
Thank you, Nikki. Chris, I want to come to you with a follow-up about skills shortage, but before I do, just remind the audience that we would love to receive your questions. We've had a few come through, some really good questions that I'll come to after Chris speaks to the skills shortage. But just to our audience, please feel free to send through your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Chris, what's your perspective on the skills shortage relating to design, contract administration, and the lack of expertise in risk management? And this is a particular problem in the region. If you see this, what's driving it?
Yeah, and honestly, as of today's day, I don't really see this. I don't think we're experiencing a lack of expertise in that space on the projects that we're looking at, or others are seeing as well. In the past, I think arguably that could have been the case. So we had, and I'm talking quite a long time in the past, so if we were to look back maybe 15, 20 years, and the region was just starting to get into that nation building phase, it was still taking time for that expertise to either migrate here or develop here. And I think those who arrived around that time would have found, for example, procurement relatively unsophisticated compared to, and risk management unsophisticated compared to where they had come from, that had maybe many centuries of nation building. I think where we've got to now very quickly, the region has got to the space where there is adequate skills around that particular piece. I completely agree with Nikki around the delivery piece. There is definitely challenges there, but in terms of that risk management piece, the design piece as well, I think the expertise is there. I think the professions probably have to work harder to make sure there's a decent pipeline coming through the universities to make sure that continues to be the case. So, but otherwise, I don't think it's an issue of necessarily skills shortage. I think it is the issues that we're seeing is far more around how we're building teams at the front end of the projects, how we're communicating across the supply chain, so not just in the contracting space, but covering the consultants and also the clients, and also being open to best practice that we see in other parts of the world. So I think it's more around what we're doing or could do, as opposed to not having the skills available to do it.
Thank you, Chris. Let's turn to some audience questions here. There's two in particular that I might turn to. Nicola, we have a very specific question from Barry about the Insight report. He says, although 83% overrun and 35.7% on costs, what percentage were recognized as valid for relief? Do you have any comments about that?
I'm not quite sure what that means, Ken, to be honest, but I don't know whether it's possible for the questioner to provide a follow-up question so that I can answer it. But if it's a specific percentage number that he's looking for, I'll probably have to establish that for him outside this forum and come back. Okay,
good answer. There's been a few questions in regards to contracts. So, for example, there's a question about avoidance and how it relates to the procurement model, and whether the procurement model in the region might be to blame for some disputes. There's a related question about, in the Middle East, allocation of risk is on the contractor, and whether that is unnecessarily adversarial, and if there's a need for rebalancing. Would anybody like to speak to contracts?
I can take the first part of that if you like, Ken. I think I would pretty much agree with both parts of that. I don't think there's been the region has not used the available agility, if you like, across contract forms for projects in different states. So, for example, it's very easy to say, don't start a project till the design is complete. Sometimes you can't do that. But if you can't do that, then there's ways of procuring, there's ways of buying that construction and that design such that you can achieve it without creating unnecessary risk transfer onto the supplier or the provider of those services. We're not very good here in actually using those available options. As you mentioned, the acknowledgement of two-stage contracting in KSA is great. It's welcome, but those options were always available. They were always there. So I think we can be probably a little bit more agile around that. And then that also translates into the follow-up question around the risk allocation. If you get the procurement wrong, then the risk allocation is probably going to be wrong as well, because it's unreasonable to expect a supplier to complete a project where the design is incomplete or be able to provide for it, because there's too much uncertainty. There's too much lack of knowledge about what might be coming up. So I think for me, it's around using the tools that we've actually already got and probably having a little bit more agility around it.
Thanks, Chris. Nikki, let's turn to you. Are the adoption of digital technologies providing new or better routes to prevent litigation, claims, and disputes in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the digital technologies in general are helping projects and delivery teams. I'm sure you're all familiar at this time with the concepts of project management software, maybe building information modeling, document management systems. These are all helping to improve communication, collaboration, and information management throughout the project lifecycle. And I think having these in place and maybe looking at concepts of integrated project delivery accelerates the need for stakeholders to interact more, as opposed to sending their email and doing what they believe it's that they're part of the work, and continue to work in silos. I found that on BIM projects there's more collaboration. I still didn't find an environment where you can track everything, all the changes. There are a few, but none of them does everything that we wanted to do. But I think it's a place where you have clear times where information was shared, by whom, who it was edited by, and so on. And I think this, in addition to digital maybe approaches to design and delivery, we could also start looking more into how we play with data, how we manipulate it, how we structure it, because there's some artificial intelligence and machine learning that can be taken on projects, employed on projects, which will make everyone's role much easier, or it will allow us more time to focus on what's more important, as I like to call it, to work smarter, not harder. So I think digital technologies everywhere are helping to reduce the risk of disputes, claims, and litigation. And I think maybe Nicola has more experience with this when she's assisting. I think probably contractors are the ones who are lagging behind, but getting records from contractors, it's very, very difficult. And most times you'll find them on papers. There's a few good or better contractors, more innovative ones, which understood the advantages of adopting technologies, document management services, and they will have that information right away. But others, maybe Nicola and her colleagues, will wait for months until they get some records.
Thank you, Nikki. We're receiving a number of questions from the audience on the theme of contracts, and maybe I'll pull one out now and see if one of the panels can speak to it. Serena asks, how do the panelists think that claims throughout the project can be more efficiently managed? For example, how can they better balance the need to continue construction versus ensuring cash flow? Any thoughts on that?
I think, I don't know whether this directly answers the question, but I think one of the points that occurred to me is almost as a sort of lessons learned. One of the subsequent questions we're going to talk about in a minute is the need for dispute resolution procedures in any contract to be sort of stepped. I can talk more about that in a minute, but I think by including a detailed stepped dispute resolution process, that does a couple of things. It adds structure and makes sure that the process is agreed between the parties at the beginning of the project. But I think more importantly, our experience is that if you include those sort of provisions, that it does encourage discussion and negotiation on the project, and that in turn can help to avoid the matter escalating really to informal dispute resolution.
Great. And Nicola, on that theme, wanted to ask you, as an industry in the Middle East, as the industry adjusts to more technically advanced projects, what lessons can be learned to avoid further distress on capital projects? Could you speak?
Is that to me, Ken?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, sure. So I guess I would say, and again, Chris, I think touched on this earlier, for me, lesson number one would be around taking more time over project initiation. So I think one of the keys for me is that maturity of the project. There's a great quote from a book on mega projects, which says that in terms of mega projects, if you hit the ground running, all you do is fall. And I think that that's absolutely true. And I think the trick is to go slow at first during project preparation, but so that you can run fast later during delivery. And I guess aligned with that are some of the techniques that we talked about earlier around two-stage tendering and early contractor involvement. And I think this allows, the beauty of this is that it allows the main contractor to join the conversation a lot earlier. And what that can do then is to really make sure that the project does achieve that greater maturity by the time everybody is on board for delivery. And that he can contribute to such things as buildability of the proposed design, logistics of construction, and timing and phasing. And I think, you know, particularly in our cost inflationary market at the moment, that potential for early engagement, possibly early engagement of the supply chain as well, is key. I think lesson two for me is around the appropriate procurement and contracting strategy. And I think that in the context of the particular project that's being considered, I think probably this speaks to a couple of the questions we talked about earlier. So I think this is about, think about the packaging strategy. Can this particular project be delivered as a single EPC? Does it need, is it sufficiently large that it needs breaking down into more than one package? If it does, how's that going to work? How are you going to manage the interface? What's the best way to break down those packages? I think it's around the commercial model. You know, is a lump sum fixed price really going to secure the best outcomes? I think there's this idea, certainly in the heads of some, that, you know, that gives cost certainty or project certainty. But I think one thing we can take from CRUX is it absolutely doesn't do that. So, you know, is that the most appropriate way to contract? And then I think in terms of the contract, it is, after all, in many ways, the primary risk management tool. So again, I would say continue to update it to reflect the circumstances of that specific project. And I think, again, in terms of the contract, you know, what are the implications of the technology that's being used on the project? If we're talking about technically advanced projects, do we need to, are there some issues that need to be covered in the contract that would not feature if the project was less complex? So could be things around cybersecurity, licensing, updates, anything really that is probably not normally a feature in a standard construction project, but now might need to be considered. And I think the same applies for modern methods of construction as well. That's quite different to traditional building, and it may be that the procurement strategy would need to change to reflect that. Third lesson, I think, is the importance of the competency of the project team. And I think this probably picks up again on Chris's earlier point, where he sort of differentiated between skill shortages and team building or team competence, I guess. So I think this is probably around make sure that there is a competent project team and they're on board sufficiently ahead of the project award, that has sufficiently qualified people, that they're experienced in risk management. It's about leadership and creating the right culture on the project. So creating a strong project culture and being mindful, I think, of the culture of the parties that are involved. About making sure that all the projects have appropriate corporate oversight, because this helps to avoid project siloing, which we see is often a factor in negative claiming. And then finally, I think probably we just touched on this actually, was just around including detailed dispute resolution provisions in the contract. And our experience is that this does help to avoid formal disputes.
Thank you. Following on, we have another audience question, which really follows on from the points about skills shortage, but maybe I'll turn to you first, Chris. This also speaks to professionalism and your role as a leader at RICS, a professional body, might have some insight. Sudair asks, in almost every project here, more than a decade, I have experienced that most of the disputes arise due to incompetent person administering the contract, which only a trained and qualified professional should handle. And his question is whether employers, contractors, and consultants appear to be missing something in recruiting the right talent, or what could be the reason. Chris, do you have any comments on that?
Well, first of all, I'm really sorry to hear that that's the case. I think and as I mentioned before, my experience was that this was, you could see evidence of this in the past, not so much now. There's no doubt that it probably does exist, as the questioner points out, and I think that the need to ensure adequate training of staff, particularly through the professional bodies, where you don't just get a set of letters after your name, you also get access to a huge amount of resource to actually help you deliver the job correctly. So I suppose it's still, I would agree, it must still be, I don't necessarily see it so often, it's probably still there in patches. It has improved, and even from the RICS point of view, certainly other professions are seeing it as well, but we are seeing clients and government upskilling their own staff in terms of that professional training in order to fill that gap. So it's definitely improving, and I think from an expertise perspective, I think we should be seeing the back of that soon. Honestly, I think I'm quite optimistic in this space. I would say that acceleration in the application of the correct professional training has probably only happened over the last 4 or 5 years. I think that's probably true. And then prior to that, there wasn't so much focus on it, but it's, in my view, it's definitely helping.
Thanks, Chris. Nikki, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on it as well, because having worked in contracting, consultancy, and also on the client side, I felt that at times some of the consultants or contract administrators on site would be biased to maybe achieve unnecessary additional savings for the client, believing that this is the way they should do it. And I think the story I give all the time is, maybe you start with a contractor, or sorry, with a client, you draft a contract for your consultant and for your contractor, and for some reason 5 years down the line you get to work on that contract, but as a consultant. And my question is always, how do you see it now from someone else's perspective? And maybe later on, again, some more years down the line, you work for a contractor and you look at the same contract that you drafted when you were with the client. How do you see it when you're a contractor? Because for me, you should see it the same way, no matter which part of the fence, as they call it, you are. You should be fair. And I think this is what also Chris said with having chartered professionals working on projects. I think it adds a bit more trust into what we do on sites, in offices, and everywhere in the built environment.
Thank you. Well, we have just less than 10 minutes left. And why don't we go to a final question? We can go through the panel. Maybe start with you, Nikki, as you have the microphone. What are your hopes for the region's industry in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, I've attended some market intelligence webinar last week, and from my point of view, there's optimism in the Middle East construction industry, and the future for our sector looks bright. There's many opportunities for growth and development, and these are driven by a number of factors. And again, I think Chris is also very passionate about this. The first one would be sustainability. UAE also declared this year the year of sustainability. We've got COP28 coming to Dubai in November. Also economic growth, that's another important factor. Government investment, adoption of what we spoke earlier in terms of digital, all the technologies and all the tools that we can use. Also, because we're talking about the region, I think integration at different levels, social, economical, integration within the region will be important. We touched upon the workforce, which needs to be skilled or upskilled or maybe further trained. And last but not least, we need to look at improving the contractual arrangements. It's important for us to remember that the construction industry is cyclical and that companies should be prepared to adapt to changing conditions in the years to come. In a number of places now, contractors are exaggerating in their bids, and maybe it's a contractor's market in some parts of the Middle East at the moment, but that's not fair, and I don't think it'll last for too long. But overall, just to wrap it up, I think there is lots of optimism in the Middle East construction industry.
Thank you, Nikki. Can we go to you, Nicola? What are your hopes for the region in 2023?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I think if I think about that in the context of our discussion today, I guess in terms of improving project delivery in the region, I would say, yeah, quite a long wish list really. So I think probably as a piece around a move away from the current usual risk transfer position. So move away from that transactional approach with a full risk transfer over to the contractors and move towards more relational and collaborative working practices. It would be great if we saw the publication of the playbook that we talked about earlier. Some more work around some of the government recommended local forms. As Nikki said, continued government support for modern methods of construction and for construction technologies. And then perhaps some innovative incentivization as well that would look to align the interests of the parties around the successful completion of the project. And then I think one thing around, particularly related to disputes, I think would be the introduction of standing dispute boards.
Thank you. And final word to you, Chris, before we close.
Thank you, Ken. And I fully support everything that Nikki and Nicola have mentioned, and made my job to finish this off quite hard actually, because I think that was a great list. I think for me, I think the region's got a huge opportunity, bearing in mind the type, complexity, and scale of the projects that are coming into this market, the economic position of this region as well, which is far more optimistic than other parts of the world. I think this opportunity here to actually be the center of best practice in terms of construction procurement, and rather than being seen as the lagging indicator, to actually be seen as the leading indicator. And I think we've definitely now got the people here. I'm quite optimistic about that. And I think we've got also the project owners and clients are very receptive to seeing how they can get better project outcomes out of their projects.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you all. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Nikki. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Want to give special thanks to HKA for the CRUX Insight report. Although we touched on it today, that's no replacement for getting a hold of that report and devouring it. It's great insight, not to be missed. Get your copy. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your evening or afternoon or morning, whatever it may be. And we will see you next time. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.